What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Christian worship and prayer?
In addition to the cross or crucifix, Christians use a variety of ritual objects. More commonly in liturgical communities than in non-liturgical ones. The more elaborate the liturgical practice, in general, the more kinds of symbolic and practical implements are required. Most Christian churches have an altar on a raised platform in front of, or in the midst of, the congregation. Exceptions are Pentecostal and similar groups whose primary rituals revolve entirely around preaching, singing, and the ongoing interaction of the leaders with the congregation. Churches such as the Roman and Anglo-Catholic, most Eastern churches and some Lutheran groups feature a ritual that includes some reenactment of the Eucharistic prayer. Their ritual leader typically wears special vestments and handles the sacred vessels. A large cup called the chalice, traditionally either made of or lined with precious metal, holds the wine, grape juice in some churches. A still larger vessel called the ciborium, Latin for food container, kept covered except during the prayers of consecration, holds the altar bread either in the form of small unleavened wafers or leavened cubes that can be dipped into the wine before dispensing to communicants. Another common implement used in more elaborate liturgies is the Thursdayable or incense burner. A small spherical container with a lighted charcoal for igniting grains of incense, which is swung from a chain in gestures of benediction. Less common but worth mentioning if only because of its artistic beauty is the ostensorium or monstrance. A large ornate device shaped like a spectacular sunburst or a small Gothic cathedral used for displaying the consecrated host during special processions or for Western congregational adoration.
What is a votive offering?
Votive offerings are directly associated with the making of vows. From the Latin votum, something promised, in connection with requests for special favors. When religious believers visit a special holy place, they often write their needs on some object and leave the object within the sacred precincts. They vow to perform certain devotional or charitable acts if the deity will grant their request. Votive offerings include any of hundreds of ways in which people symbolize their willingness to repay the divine favor. Among the more common devotional acts are those associated with visiting holy places or making pilgrimages. The devotee promises, for example, to approach the place on his or her knees from a certain point, or to make a certain number of prostrations before a particular sacred image. One of the most widespread of votive practices is the lighting of small candles after making an offering to the holy place. In some instances, the use of candles has become dissociated from making vows in the truest sense of that term, so that lighting a wick often merely symbolizes or accompanies a request for divine help. Larger places of worship in many traditions provide appropriate votive Offerings for sale in small shops attached to the church, temple, or shrine. For a fee, considered part of the offering. Devotees receive an object such as a small statue of a holy person associated with the place, a devotional card, or even a tiny replica of the holy place itself or some part thereof. For example, adherents of Shinto often hang miniature torii gates on racks designed to receive hundreds of them.
Is there such a thing as converting to Daoism?
In relatively recent times, Daoism has attracted increasing interest among people outside China. A quick scan of internet sites affords a fair impression of contemporary Euro-American interpretations of the ancient Chinese tradition. Many non-Chinese who are attracted to Daoism gravitate toward the philosophical rather than to the theistic or religious elements. Some proponents of New Age beliefs have adopted the use of Daoist divinatory techniques, especially the interpretation of the hexagrams by consulting the I Ching. But on the whole, non-Chinese who express an active interest in Daoism do not convert to the tradition the way one would when becoming, say, a Muslim or a Christian. Since Daoism is so intertwined with an integrated worldview that is profoundly Chinese, it is almost a contradiction in terms to talk of becoming a Daoist.
Do Confucians celebrate the birthdays of any religious figures?
September 28 of each year marks the birthday of Confucius in Taiwan. For example, and there it has also been declared Teachers' Day. In the People's Republic of China, celebrations of the day have been forbidden since the Maoist Revolution of 1948. Largely because of Confucianism's long-standing association with imperial rule. Taiwanese celebrations, however, are still elaborate and traditional. Beginning at 6 in the morning according to ancient practice. Ceremonies commence with ritual drumming followed by a procession in which participants, dressed in ancient regalia, carry in special symbols to welcome the spirit of Confucius. Processional symbols include a royal canopy and fan, as well as ritual long-handled axes. In the capital city, Taipei, the celebration is modeled on the ancient pattern in which literati bureaucrats performed the main rituals. There, the mayor presides over the various ranks of governmental employees and educational administrators, joined by ranks of students of different ages. Birthdays of particular deities or immortals do not play a role in Confucianism or CIT as they do in Daoism and CCT.
Are dreams and visions important to Buddhist tradition?
Important figures in Buddhist tradition are said to have learned essential truths through dreams and visions. Queen Maya dreamed that she would give birth under unusual circumstances to a child who would become the Buddha. In dreams, famous people learn of the proper course of action. Buddhist sources tell, for example, of how a dream persuaded the Chinese Emperor Mingdi to send for Buddhist missionaries and scriptures. Stories of this sort are told about many holy persons throughout Buddhist history, usually as a vehicle for underscoring the individual's personal authority. Accounts of dreams and visions are by no means uniquely Buddhist, of course, and tell us more about the tone and feel of popular Buddhist lore than about the tradition's central teachings. Visionary meditative techniques, a different matter altogether, are of great importance in some Mahayana schools. Esoteric schools, such as those of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, use mandalas as visual aids in complicated techniques for creating mental images. The meditator generates a visionary world patterned on the mandala, in which the divine and the human interact and all distinctions vanish. Simpler visualization techniques are used in the more popular Pure Land tradition as well. Facing west, the meditator visualizes the sun setting, and water turning into ice. Gradually, the mind fills with images of a golden land with crystalline streams, lotus-filled lakes with golden bottoms, and shores of diamond sand. As the Pure Land, with its myriad jeweled palaces, takes shape in the mind's eye, the meditator sees the Buddha Amitabha and his attendant bodhisattvas. At length the meditator visualizes himself being reborn into that happy land enfolded in a lotus flower.
Do all religious traditions send out missionaries?
Attitudes toward proselytizing, making converts, vary tremendously from one tradition to another. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism are the three great missionary traditions. But within each of these there are considerable differences in emphasis on missionary activity. Some Christian groups support enormous mission operations, at least indirectly through private donation, all over the world. Other, generally smaller, groups make no attempt to mobilize their limited resources in order to proselytize. In between are Christians who consider it the ordinary duty of every believer to evangelize simply by sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Muslims have also had a history of vigorous missionary work. Most Muslims consider inviting dwa others to the faith a fundamental duty. In more recent times, however, Muslims have engaged in less widespread organized and institutionally funded missionary activity. Buddhist missionary work, especially between about 300 BCE and 600 CE, led to the spread of the faith from India throughout Central, East, and Southeast Asia. Today small-scale efforts continue, but are generally quite low-key. A few Hindu groups, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and the Vedanta Society, have dedicated themselves in modern times to spreading their word. But on the whole, Major missionary efforts have not been significant in other traditions.
What do Confucians believe about ultimate spiritual reality?
Two of the most important concepts that define what Confucius and his followers thought about ultimate spiritual reality are the Dao and heaven, Tian. Confucian texts do not always make clear how the two differ, and at times it seems they are virtually interchangeable. In Confucian teaching, the Dao and heaven are generally non-personal realities that are equivalent, respectively, to a primordial or eternal cosmic law, Dao, and the source of that law, heaven. Early Confucian texts emphasize the immanent, rather than the transcendent, aspect of the Dao. For example, Confucius is reported to have observed that the Dao is very close to human beings. Dao is therefore accessible and knowable, but that does not mean the Dao is not also mysterious. Confucius did not simply deny the existence of transcendent realities. He preferred to interpret ultimate reality from the ground up, so to speak. Many of history's great theologians have constructed their systems of thought by beginning with the existence of some divine reality and working their way down. Not Confucius. He was interested primarily in the ethical implications of traditional teachings that he had inherited. He apparently thought of heaven as the ultimate moral authority or principle. Heaven makes its will known to, and through, an upright sovereign. What heaven discloses is, in turn, the Dao. Confucius reportedly described his Dao as consisting of two fundamental ethical components: responsibility or loyalty, Yung, and reciprocity, Shu. His interpretation of Dao and heaven is therefore quite different from the traditional Daoist interpretation. In much of Daoist thought, Dao has priority and gives rise to heaven, which in turn manifests the 10,000 things that many people call creation or the universe.
What is a monk and how are Buddhist monasteries organized?
In its wider sense, monk refers to any male Buddhist who enters a monastic institution, whether permanently or for a short time, receiving at least the lower ordination to the status of novice, Shramanera. Strictly speaking, a monk is a male at least 20 years old who has been in the monastery at least 5 years and received the higher ordination to the status of bhikshu, mendicant. Monasteries are generally independent and autonomous foundations, rather like Benedictine monasteries in Roman Catholicism, a very loose analogy. Buddhist monasteries of the same lineage or order are administered separately. Each monastery's internal structure combines offices positions assigned by a monastic council or other governing body and ranks distinctions often based on seniority or spiritual acumen. Offices in a Japanese Zen monastery include, for example, chief abbot, In a complex with many sub-monasteries and temples, abbot, kancho, Zen master, Rashi, meditation leader and disciplinarian. Jikijutsu, in the Zendo or meditation hall, administrator of the Zendo, Jisha, and head cook. An important rank is that of head monk, Jushoku, who might also hold the office of abbot in a sub-temple. Similarly, in Thai Theravada monasteries offices include abbots and meditation masters. And recognize various ranks, such as those of elder, Thera, 10 years seniority, and great elder, Mahathera, with 20 years seniority.
What is religious Daoism and what are its origins?
Daoism refers to a wide range of philosophical, religious, and magical traditions dating from perhaps the 4th century BCE in China. Here the focus will be on the specifically religious aspects of these complex and ancient developments. The most ancient roots of the tradition were in shamanistic cults dating back perhaps several millennia to prehistoric China. Legendary imperial figures of that age, Yu, Shun, and Yao, are still revered as great sages. According to legend, Daoism formally began with Lao Zi's writing of the Dao De Jing, the classic of the Way and its power in the 6th century BCE. Scholars now believe the Dao De Jing actually dates from between 300 and 250 BCE. Teachings of the Dao De Jing came together with those of thinkers like Yang Zhu, 340 to 266 BCE, and Zhuangzi, 369 to 286 BCE, to form the broad conceptual basis of a wider Daoist tradition that had become largely philosophical, Daochia, by the 4th century BCE. But religious Daoism, Daoqiao, was still a long way off. Solid scholarly research suggests that Daoism as a religious tradition begins in the mid-2nd century CE. It seems a teacher named Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE, claimed that Lao Zi himself commissioned him to spread the teaching of the Dao. Zhang inaugurated the 5 bushels of rice movement, a reference to the suggested offering for would-be members, and built a religious polity in Sichuan province. According to legend, Zhang Daoling's emphasis on acquiring immortality culminated in his ascension into the heavens. Out of that movement grew the first and one of the most influential branches of religious Daoism, the Celestial Masters School. Religious Daoism has since developed numerous sects and schools, each with its distinctive emphasis on various spiritual teachings and ritual practices.
Is there such a thing as Confucian fundamentalism?
Confucian scholars have devised a wide range of methods for interpreting the classical sources. Many of the central concepts in Confucian thought are simply too large and subtle to interpret literally. Take the notion of the mandate of heaven, for example. Dynasties have come and gone frequently in China's long history, and many have interpreted dynastic decay as a sure indication that the emperor had lost his contact with heaven's will. That is an easy enough judgment to make in retrospect. But using the mandate theory as a criterion for deciding whether the people are justified in bringing down this regime now is a much more complicated matter. Some interpreters have chosen to apply the criteria of the classical sources directly to current events. They have their Christian counterparts, for example, in those who have discerned portents of the apocalypse in the world around them at various times in history. Some Confucian texts have lent themselves more readily to literal interpretation, so much so that their prescriptions have become the very fabric of life for countless Chinese who have never set foot in a Confucian temple. Those are books like the Ligie, with its detailed descriptions of ritualized relationships across the full spectrum of human activity.
Do Muslims practice polygamy?
Long before the beginnings of Islam, plural marriage was a fairly common practice. A number of the biblical patriarchs and kings had several wives. Wealthier men of the pre-Islamic Arab tribes apparently engaged in polygamy, marrying as many wives as their wealth would allow. A major concern seems to have been that, in the inhospitable environs of that desert world, women not attached to families had little hope of survival. As cities like Mecca developed, the practice survived in somewhat modified form. But according to a text of the Quran, polygamy in the early Muslim community was to be limited. A man could marry up to 4 women, provided he could treat all of his wives with complete equity both materially and emotionally. In modern times, a number of national governments in the Middle East have outlawed the practice, arguing that modern social and economic conditions have made perfectly fair treatment all but impossible. Even where local laws allow polygamy, relatively few men marry more than 1 woman. And those who marry 4 are a very small minority.
How does the hierarchy among Shinto shrines work?
Over the centuries, Shinto authorities have devised a number of structures and classifications by which to distinguish various levels and functions of shrines. The most important is called the shrine rank system, Sheikakusaido. That has been in place since shortly after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Jingu designates shrines of top rank under imperial auspices, such as Meiji Jingu, in Tokyo, which enshrines royal ancestors, and Ise Jingu, which is at the top of the hierarchy and is called the Daijingu, Grand Imperial Shrine. Next in rank are the approximately 100,000 Jinjia, a generic term including virtually all shrines larger than little wayside structures. About 250 are included on a special list of highest-ranking ones. Of these, some 200 were designated prior to World War II as governmental shrines, kancha. Many larger jinjia have spawned affiliated or branched shrines called buncha. Multiple shrines dedicated to a single kami generally constitute distinct families, with one shrine usually acknowledged as the original foundation from which branched shrines developed. Some very important jinjia, such as Kajaga in Nara and about a dozen others, have the honorific title Taisha, Grand Shrine, roughly equivalent to Cathedral Basilica. They are also part of a cluster of 22, Niju Nisha, institutions elevated to special status. But even they are divided into 3 levels, 7 high, 7 middle ranking, and 8 lower. That grouping arose out of the practice of ranking shrines within a given region according to their order of priority on pilgrimage routes, or to guide devotees intent on visiting a sequence of holy places. In various prefectures, a further ranking of area shrines simply lists them as first, second, or third shrine, acknowledging the 3 regional shrines that draw the largest crowds of worshippers. A number of jinjia, some count 138, have been specially designated as nation-protecting shrines. Gokoku jinjia, because of their dedication to the souls of those who died in battle. 27 shrines within that category, also called deceased spirit-invoking shrines, Shokansha, have been accorded a special rank because of the importance of the heroes from all periods of Japanese history that they commemorate. Tokyo's Yasukuni Jinjia ranks at the top of that category. Before 1945, countless smaller local memorials represented the bottom of this hierarchical category. The main central administration is called the Association of Shinto Shrines. Jinjia Honcho, which has branches, called Jinjia-cho, in each Japanese prefecture.
What does one do to convert to Islam?
Converting to Islam is a relatively simple matter. Interested individuals have typically already done some basic study of the tradition, but no prescribed course of religious education is required or expected. Naturally, most Muslims believe that the more converts know about the tradition and its history, the more likely they can make an informed decision. Before entering into the brief ceremony that renders a candidate officially Muslim, the convert performs the major purification ritual called ghusl. Formal assent to the tenets of Islam entails a simple repetition of the Shahada before any 2 adult male witnesses.
Who is the Virgin Mary?
Mary, the mother of Jesus, occupies a preeminent position in the theology of the traditional Eastern and Western churches. Information about her life is extremely limited, Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2. it is clear that Matthew and Luke believed that Mary's conception of Jesus was miraculous, involving no human paternity, and that her son was the Messiah expected by Israel. Mary belonged to the house of David, Luke 1:26, was engaged to man called Joseph. Matthew 1:18, and lived in Nazareth in Lower Galilee, Luke 1:26. The Gospel of Luke relates that an angel of God announced that she, although a virgin, would conceive the Son of the Most High, to be named Jesus, and that he would found a new Davidic kingdom. Luke 1:30-133. Mary consented. When Joseph discovered that Mary was with child, he wished to dissolve the engagement quietly. In a dream, however, God's angel admonished him to marry Mary because the son she would bear was the result of divine intervention, Matthew 1:19-21. The dates of Mary's life can only be surmised. Researchers place the birth of Jesus between 7 and 4 BCE, granting Mary a minimal age of 16 to 18 years at the time of Jesus' birth. This would place her birth at some time between 20 to 22 BCE. There is no precise information as to her death. At the Council of Ephesus in 431, Mary was proclaimed the Theotokos, God-bearer, or Mother of God. Her position was further defined in the Roman Catholic Church, which in 1854 stated as an article of faith that Mary had been conceived without the original sin that affects all humanity. In 1950, Pius XII declared that at her death Mary's body had not corrupted in the grave, but that God had taken both her body and soul into heaven.
Does anything like millennialism have a place in Islamic thinking?
Yes, so long as one understands millennialism broadly rather than as a precise reference to measures of 1,000 years. Numerous hadith, called traditions of discord, talk of various general features that mark a decidedly downward trend in human life. Honesty will be hard to find. Fewer and fewer people will observe the religious law, and violence will rise. According to other ancient traditions, various explicit signs will herald the end of time itself. A resurgence of chaos symbolized by Gog and Magog will mark a radical turn for the worse. The beginning of the final chapter in the unraveling of history. A figure resembling the prophet, called the Mahdi, Guided One, will usher in a temporary age of justice. Numerous individuals throughout the history of Islam have sought to gain political power by claiming to be the Mahdi, most recently in 1979. When armed bandits seized control of the sanctuary of the Kaaba in Mecca. A one-eyed Antichrist figure, called the Dajjal, that's Dajjal, will supplant the Mahdi, luring people away through magic masquerading as miracle. Jesus will eventually return to battle the Antichrist, overthrowing that false prophet and paving the way for the Day of Judgment. Shiite tradition features its own distinctive type of millenarianism. According to the Shiite interpretation of history, Muhammad's spiritual authority was passed along through a series of descendants called Imams. In the view of the 12 verse, by far the majority of Shiites. The 12th and last of these Imams, also called the Mahdi, went into greater concealment in 940. This hidden Imam did not die but has remained in a mysterious state from which he will return to establish full justice. In the meantime, the Imam hears prayers and intercedes for believers.
What are Judaism's principal sacred writings?
The Hebrew Bible is a collection of some 39 shorter works composed and edited over nearly 1,000 years and gathered in 3 large literary/theological categories. The foundational texts are known variously as the Torah, the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. A second grouping is called the prophets, and that in turn is divided into the former and latter prophets. The former prophets include the historical books of Joshua, Judges, and 2 Samuel, and 2 Kings. Among the latter prophets are the 3 major prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the so-called 12 minor prophets, Hosea, or Osee, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Finally, a category of texts collectively known as the writings includes a fascinating selection of wisdom and prophetic literature and historical documents. The lone prophetic text here is the Book of Daniel. A set of wisdom books, some traditionally attributed to David and his son Solomon. Includes Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and a mini-anthology called the 5 Scrolls, or Megillot. These include the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. 4 important historical books complete the category of the writings: Ezra, Nehemiah, and 2 Chronicles. Taken together, these sacred writings go by the acronym Tanakh, which is made up of the initial letters in the words Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings.
What does the word millennialism mean?
Millennialism, or millenarianism, refers to the general expectation that at a certain point in time human history will undergo a dramatic turnabout, resulting even in the very end of time itself and the beginning of another age. A millennium is literally a 1,000-year period, at the turning of which some communities of faith believe their historic expectation of a new dispensation will be realized. Naturally, the marking of millennial events depends on when a given religious tradition marks its own beginnings. The year 2000 has little or no religious meaning for the great majority of the world's peoples. For the most part, it is only some groups among the world's Christians who attach special significance to this event. but even for Christians the event is ambiguous since, due to anomalies in calendar calculations long ago, it is widely understood that the actual 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus has already come and gone. There is, however, a curiously broad appeal of the notion of millennium. Many have attached a vague sense of foreboding to its imminent arrival beyond concerns about the so-called Y2K computer bug. As we will see later, some traditions have a strong sense of the importance of historic expectation, even if that is not tied specifically to the turn of a true 1000-year millennium.
How and where do members of local Shinto communities come together?
Larger shrines provide the principal venue for Shinto community gatherings. The more elaborate shrines might have a dozen or more separate structures, each designed for a specific function. The ritual center includes facilities along the entry path for purification by water, as well as the various halls of worship and the sanctuary itself. There is often a separate facility in which the shrine ritual specialists purify themselves. Secondary shrine functions include a wide range of activities. Smaller buildings provide facilities for weddings, jishiki-den, sacred dance and performance of plays, kagura-den, and storage of the portable processional shrines called mikoshi. There is usually a sacred kitchen for preparing offerings and a small shop where worshippers can purchase mementos and items, such as cards on which to write petitions to be hung on special boards outside the main worship hall. Officials administer the whole operation from a shrine office, looking after all the more mundane concerns of any institution. That includes everything from scheduling of events and staff to arranging for supplies and paying bills. Smaller shrines naturally have fewer of these separate facilities, and the smallest often do not have resident priests. Shrines are organized in a variety of ways. Some are directly managed by hereditary priestly families still connected with powerful clans of old. Committees of local elders oversee many village shrines that lack permanent priests. Trade guilds, called zie, still worship together and manage their own shrines. Wealthy families sometimes even own and administer shrines just for their private use. Finally, some historic Buddhist temples have set up and maintained shrines in hopes of securing the protection of the kami for the temple. Some larger shrines attract worshippers from all over Japan, while most local shrines have relatively stable memberships of parishioners. But parishioners often have family or devotional ties to more than one local shrine.
What are some of the other days Shinto practitioners celebrate?
Obon Matsuri is one of those feasts whose timing is determined by adding a solar month to the lunar reckoning. Hence a feast formerly celebrated during the middle, i.e., full moon. of the 7th month now occurs during the middle of August, the 8th. On November 23 and 24 falls the New Food Festival, Nii name Sai. Acting as high priest, the emperor himself leads the ceremonies. When a newly enthroned emperor presides, the feast is called Great Food Festival. Daja Sai, and the ritual seals and formalizes the new ruler's accession. This is one of some 30 regular imperial ceremonies. Koshitsu Saishi, that occur through the year, most conducted privately within the palace. The autumnal equinox still calls for quite elaborate observances in some places. Suwa Shrine in Nagasaki, for example, holds its annual Okankai for 3 full rousing days and nights. Involving a full range of activities, from raucous processions to solemn pre-dawn purifications conducted in almost total silence. The festival engages large numbers of worshippers actively. Festivities begin and end with more private rituals designed to bring the kami into the ceremony and see them back to their places of repose. Some ceremonies occur often but on a more ad hoc basis than the regularly scheduled festivals. Nearly every new architectural venture occasions special religiously inspired observances. Earth sanctification, Jichinsai, is a ritual of deist origin conducted by a Shinto priest to prepare the ground for new construction. Participants call on the kami of the place for protection. These ceremonies are roughly analogous to the American practice of hoisting a small evergreen to the top of a newly completed structure, perhaps religious in origin, but now purely customary. A rite called sentasei or sengu can occur on any number of occasions. In the ritual, a kami is relocated, either permanently to a new shrine or temporarily, such as during repairs, or for a matsuri, or for a time of repose in one of several of the deity's regular abodes. In the case of Ise shrine, for example, the ceremony happens every 20 years. When a new shrine is constructed on the grounds,
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Confucian and Cit worship?
When Confucius was young, he was particularly intrigued by the classic bronze vessels his ancestors had used for centuries in honoring heaven. Most of these vessels held materials to be offered. The principal forms developed in connection with the particular types of material. A vase, was to hold sacrificial wine, a jug, zui, poured libations. And beaker, gu, may have been used for sharing a communion-like drink. The ding was a bowl for ritual foods such as cereal grains or fruit. Some of these objects apparently were designed in particularly symbolic shapes, such as the hill-shaped censer, whose form recalled the 5 sacred mountains. Some bronzes bear abstract representations of the 4 directional creatures: the black tortoise of the wintry north, the green dragon of the vernal east, the scarlet bird of the summery south, and the white tiger of the autumnal west. Inscriptions dedicating an object to a father. For example, or expressing the hope that sons and grandsons will use the vessel for 10,000 years. Suggest that they were commonly used in ancestor veneration rituals. Even today, copies of those antique objects adorn the altars in Confucian temples and are part of the relatively infrequent offerings held there. Many of the sacred vessels were buried in tombs or even thrown into river beds during invasions to prevent them from falling into the hands of barbarians. Nearly every large museum has good examples in its Asian collections, and they are well worth a visit.
Do Daoists and practitioners of CCT run private religious schools for their children?
People born into Chinese families with a long history of associations with Daoism or CCT, or both, grow up hearing about traditional beliefs. They participate, practically from infancy, in family home, and perhaps also temple rituals, and almost certainly learn the ways of ancestor veneration. There has been no need, generally, for an educational network designed to preserve ancient beliefs and practices. Traditional values, some believe, are being steadily eroded by the increasing pace of change the world over. It may be that if time-honored Chinese ways of being religious are to survive well past the millennium, those vitally interested in that survival will have to develop more formal, deliberate ways of instilling the tradition. Movement in that direction may already have begun with the revival of Daoist seminaries in the People's Republic of China.
Do Christians have a holy city?
Members of various individual churches have come to associate sanctity with a number of places uniquely important for their traditions. For Mormons, several sites along the church's difficult path from New York to Nevada are holy in retrospect, as well as nostalgically sad, because they represent places from which Mormons were expelled or where they were persecuted. Above all stands Salt Lake City, founded by Brigham Young, and seat of the church. Geneva remains a city with overtones of sanctity for Christians of Calvinist traditions. For Western Catholics, Rome is especially holy because of its place at the center of the Church's entire history and because it is Catholicism's administrative home. But perhaps the majority of Christians consider Jerusalem the only genuinely holy city, and regard the surrounding territory as the Holy Land. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the hundreds of lesser sites associated with the life and death of Jesus remain for many a source of spiritual strength and hope.
What happens when a person is slain in the spirit?
In their worship services, Pentecostal and other charismatic churches include segments during which the leader walks among the crowd or invites individuals to come forward so that he or she might pray over them. Many ask to be healed of specific ailments. The prayer leader often places one or both hands on the person's head or shoulders, sometimes raising one hand high in a gesture of blessing or petition, while the preacher or healer prays with increasing intensity. The individual may become very agitated and then seem suddenly to lose consciousness, perhaps falling back into the arms of fellow worshippers ready to break the fall. Such a worshipper is said to be slain in the Spirit, or baptized in the Holy Spirit. Sometimes the one praying appears to signal that the moment has come, by giving an extra squeeze or a slight push. Dozens or even scores of worshippers may report having this experience in the course of a service.
What is a menorah?
Menorah means an object that emits light, hence a candle holder. A 7-candle menorah was used in the ancient temple and has continued to be perhaps the most widely known and used Jewish symbol. When the Romans despoiled the Jerusalem temple in 70, they carted away all the temple's riches. They regarded the menorah as such an important emblem of their conquest that the Emperor Titus had it depicted on his triumphal arch in the Roman Forum. Some scholars suggest the menorah is a variation on the symbolic tree of life that grew at the center of the original Paradise Garden, versions of which are widely used in many cultures and religious traditions. An 8-branched candlestick, now also called a menorah, features prominently in the 8-day observance of Hanukkah.
What is Shinto and what are its origins?
Shinto derives from 2 Chinese words Shen, meaning deity, and Dao, meaning way. The Japanese reading of the Chinese expression comes out Kami no Michi, the path of the Kami. Since at least several centuries BCE, the Japanese have acknowledged the sacred presence and power of numinous beings called Kami, high or superior beings. Until about the middle of the 6th century CE, the Japanese people evidently did not think of their ancient religious traditions as a separate system. So organically integrated were those traditions with their entire culture and heritage that worship of the Kami was largely assumed as the Japanese way. Only with the arrival of Buddhism, called in Japanese the way of the Buddha, Butsudo, did it become necessary to give the indigenous beliefs and practices a name to distinguish them from this imported tradition. Unlike many other major traditions, Shinto had neither a founder nor a single foundational figure who represents concrete historical origins. In a sense, Shinto is as old as Japan itself, somewhat the way Hinduism is as old as India. At its core, the way of the Kami enshrines profound Insights into the sacred character of all created nature. Shinto calls people to a deep awareness of the divine presence suffusing all things. To the challenge of personal and corporate responsibility for the stewardship of the world that is home. To unending gratitude for all that is good. And to a willingness to seek purification and forgiveness for humanly inevitable but avoidable lapses. Observe worshippers at a Shinto shrine. As Buddhism has temples, Shinto has shrines, and there can be little doubt of the sincere devotion that moves so many people to prayer and ritual expression of their beliefs.
What is the nature of the human person in Shinto tradition?
Shinto tradition has not given great attention to speculation about the metaphysical aspects of the human person. Conceptions of soul or spirit at the core of human nature tend to be rather fluid. Not unlike popular Chinese ideas about these things. Reflecting the various aspects of both human and divine action, soul, or spirit, Tama, can manifest itself as either rich in blessings, granting harmony and union, full of mysterious power, or rough. Individuals take second place to the needs of society as a whole. As a result, traditional Shinto thought does not reflect in depth about the self apart from the collective. Above all, human beings are children of the kami whose natural birthright is to benefit from nature's gifts. Society and family, as well as nature, are the wellsprings of life. Acknowledging and venerating one's ancestors keeps healthy the link between individual and society because it keeps alive the continuity of heritage.
Shouldn't a religious tradition be more invested in turning people's attention to a world beyond this one?
In fact, these and other distinctive aspects of Shinto are among its strengths and the basis for its unique contributions to our world. Shinto offers arresting insights into the inherent divine quality of the simplest things, of the beauty hidden away in life's nooks and crannies. Shinto tradition discerns innumerable causes for profound gratitude to the powers beyond the merely human that make life itself possible. Shinto may not be celebrated for producing sophisticated schools of theological speculation, but it undoubtedly possesses many characteristics that identify it as a religious tradition.
Have Hindus traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Hinduism has generally not produced the kind of missionary activity characteristic of traditions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Significant traces of Hindu tradition and culture are very much in evidence all over Southeast Asia, especially in parts of Indonesia. Throughout late antiquity, 4th through 8th centuries, and the Middle Ages, 9th through 15th centuries, important Hindu dynasties ruled portions of present-day Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Major archaeological research attests to their splendor and power. But their trappings of Hindu symbol and ritual were less a matter of missionary zeal than of a desire to cloak themselves with the prestige of the great Indian dynasties. In addition, they sought to enhance their political legitimacy through the concept of divine kingship by identifying their monarchs as descendants of the gods. In modern times, however, a number of missionary organizations have grown from Hindu roots. In addition to the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Vivekananda's 1863 to 1902, Ramankrishna Mission has made important contributions in this regard. Although its gains have been modest in terms of numbers, the mission's members have become known for various kinds of social outreach as well as for offering lectures and spiritual guidance. In many major United States cities, branches of an organization called the Vedanta Society appeal to a well-educated public by emphasizing the traditional way of knowledge, rather than the way of devotion preferred by both Vivekananda and his teacher Ramankrishna, 1834-86.
What is the celebration called Diwali?
Diwali is one of the most important and widely celebrated of all Hindu observances. Also called Deepavali, or Row of Lights, this feast occurs in mid-autumn, October or November, technically from the 13th of Ashvina's dark half to the 2nd of Kartika's bright half. Composed of 5 distinct day-long festivities devoted to such mythic events as Krishna's conquest of 2 demons and Shiva's reconciliation with Parvati. Shaivites and Vaishnavites alike observe the occasion, marking it as theirs by dedicating the middle night of the 5 to either Kali's bringing Shiva under control or Vishnu's consort Lakshmi, respectively. Socially speaking, the feast belongs to the merchant castes. Diwali, strictly so called, occurs on the 4th day, recalling Rama's return to his royal throne in Ayodhya to end his 14-year exile.
How do Shinto practitioners deal ritually with death and mourning?
According to a saying, Shinto marries, Buddhism buries. During the Tokugawa era, 1600 to 1868, an imperial decree stipulated that only Buddhist priests should conduct funeral rites. Most cemeteries in Japan are connected to Buddhist temples rather than Shinto shrines. But there are exceptions to that general rule, and practitioners of Shinto have important beliefs and rituals concerning death and mourning. A major difference between Buddhist and Shinto practices is that Shinto rites never occur in shrines. 4 shrines are strictly dedicated to the kami. Shinto tradition regards death as a form of evil and a serious source of pollution. Shinto belief and practice has been profoundly influenced by certain Confucian attitudes toward departed ancestors. and large numbers of Japanese still perform rites of ancestor veneration. Some Japanese families still follow the practice of enshrining a deceased person's symbols in a spirit house. Tamaya, placed beneath the home's kamidana, 7 weeks after a funeral. Some of Japan's largest shrines are dedicated to memorializing the spirits of great human beings elevated to the status of kami. Grief, kibuku, is associated with a prescribed period during which the experience of death renders family members impure. The bereaved family should stay away from shrines and refrain from Shinto ritual generally during that interval. In pre-Buddhist times, the Japanese sometimes constructed monumental memorials to the dead. Historically, lay people performed Shinto funeral rituals, with main participants wearing white. Today, Shinto rites, led by priests, occur in homes or funeral establishments. Some shrines continue to perform memorial rites for those who have died in battle.
What is at the heart of the Confucian Temple?
Looking into the courtyard, you would see the main structure. The freestanding central memorial hall on a raised platform. Until the 14th century, most if not all Confucian temples would have had a full complement of statues of Confucius and the other major sages. As a result of an imperial decree in 1530, some date the change to 1382. Pictures and statues of the great teacher and his spiritual comrades were replaced by memorial spirit tablets bearing the names of the sages and scholars. The main hall's Dezheng central altar houses the tablets of Confucius, named the most holy former master, the wise Kong, and his 4 most important followers. Yanhui, Zusi, Zhengzi, and Mengzi. Over the central altar is a panel that reads "Teach without discrimination." In other words, accept all sincere comers as potential students. Along the right and left walls of the main hall are side altars, each bearing 6 tablets commemorating the 12 sages, 11 students of Confucius, and one of the founders of the medieval development called Neo-Confucianism, Zushi, 1130 to 1200 CE. In the rooms along the right and left sides of the main courtyard you would see several more altars on which are enshrined 154 more name tablets. 40 sages and 37 scholars on the east, 39 sages and 38 scholars on the west. These major historical figures represent the cream of the literati over many centuries. Finally, behind the main memorial hall, along the north wall of the courtyard, stands a room, the Yungzheng, enshrining tablets of 5 generations of Confucius ancestors.
What is India and why is it religiously important?
India is a large diamond-shaped land mass bounded to the north by the Himalaya Mountains, to the west by the Arabian Sea, and to the east by the Bay of Bengal. To the northwest is the vast plain of the Indus River system, and to the northeast that of the Ganges and its tributaries. Prior to 1947, India included what is now the nation-state of Pakistan and covered some 1.7 million square miles. Roughly half the size of the United States of America. Today India's population approaches 1 billion, with the populations of Pakistan and Bangladesh, which split from Pakistan in 1971, totaling another third of a billion. India is the original home of both Buddhism and Hinduism, as well as of the smaller Jain and Sikh religious traditions.
Is number symbolism important in Hindu tradition?
Dozens of numbers retain traditional symbolic meanings for many Hindus. The number 1 recalls divine unity and the light of the sun. The number 2 is associated with the moon and all the dual features of ordinary human life, such as all the paired parts of the body. The number 4 is the number of the Vedas, 10 that of Vishnu's principal avatars, while 18 represents the number of sections in both the epic Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. Perhaps the single most widely acknowledged sacred number is 108. It is arrived at by adding the 7 planets to the moon's 2 phases and multiplying by the 12 signs of the zodiac. The number 108 is the number of seats of the goddess Sati, Shiva's wife, as well as the sum of all Upanishads.
What is a ritual object or implement?
Ritual objects include a large number of items, both symbolic and practical, that are the essential devices of religious practice. They may be as outwardly pedestrian as containers for the raw materials of religious offering: rice, salt, wine, bread, or the utensils needed to move those materials around. These tools often have no major symbolic meaning but are largely utilitarian, though they are generally regarded as sacred because of the context and are not to be used for non-ritual purposes. Many other ritual objects are more symbolic than practical in function. Every tradition has its symbols for the ultimate spiritual reality, for the various kinds of benefits and blessings believers seek from that reality, and for the gifts devotees bring as offerings. Among the most common are images or icons, books or scrolls of sacred text, lamps, musical instruments, weapons, and special vestments or garb for officiants and sometimes participants.